Well, again, thanks Frank, Arye, and Chris for being here. So as we all know, we're in a different world. We're in the age of COVID, and you know we serve as outside general counsel to many companies. So we're in discussions with venture firms and other firms, getting a pulse and a temperature for what it means for them to be quote unquote open for business during the age of COVID. So my first question for you guys is, now that we've lived in this world now for 8+ weeks, what does it mean to be quote unquote open for business, or perhaps not open for business in this new world? And Frank, why don't we start with you, and then we'll go to Arye and then Chris.
Yeah, I guess my off mute now. Yes. Yeah. The quick answer is open for business. So I can walk outside and not have a mask on as long as there's nobody within 6 feet of me except my kids, and I'm exercising. I think I've got that straight. I'm not sure, but the rules seem to change every day, so I'm trying to keep up with it. You know, it's an interesting question because I do get asked this question a lot, and I think it presents opportunities really on both sides, both the COVID side and really a lot on the non-COVID side, to be honest. So obviously with, you know, the entire biotech, biopharma, large pharma community being all hands on deck for solutions related to COVID, whether they're diagnostic or therapeutic or vaccine, et cetera, which is fantastic. And, you know, we're seeing a number of those types of things. We have one portfolio company involved in a vaccine related effort. We have one therapeutic under diligence, another, although we don't technically do diagnostics, I'm actually advising a diagnostics play, which would be the first consumer-based play in that area. But what I think it's interesting that it's doing is it's actually now showing that there's a lot of really cool stuff going on that's not COVID, and it's not necessarily getting a lot of attention, certainly not the last 2 to 3 months, whatever. And so their valuations are getting a little depressed. That becomes a bit more interesting for us. They're stretched a bit from a cash flow and a burn rate perspective, especially at the earlier stages. So I'm seeing a lot of interesting opportunities in what I'll just loosely call the non-COVID world. And this is really kind of across the board stuff. And it's not like these things aren't obviously interesting in their own right, but because they haven't got as much attention in the last bunch of months, you know, they're becoming stretched financially in some cases. It's presenting some interesting opportunities.
Thanks.
Yeah, I can jump in, Jason. Yeah, I think that the phrase "open for business" is really interesting one, and it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. I think it's very clear that the world is not going back to the way it was pre-COVID. It is a different world, and I think we do need to kind of wrap our heads around that. We don't know exactly what that means, but it's not just going to sort of retire back. The tide won't just come back into the same level it was at before. So, you know, I think about that phrase in the context of a lot of our portfolio companies, who are some of them in the fundraising process, some of them trying to be open for business in terms of working in the lab and continuing their research. So it's become very much a case-by-case exercise in determining what's the best path forward. If you're in the fundraising process, it's probably going to take a little longer. And that may just be a factor of us investors kind of waiting a little bit to see if valuations come down, or even us investors having too much work to do right now and being extremely busy, and not even considering all of the family stuff that's going on in people's lives that's taking them away from the office, or dealing with kids and having sort of a disrupted home life. So that process could take a little longer. So your version of open for business might be trying to extend your runway a little bit. You're now thinking about getting back into the lab. A lot of these companies have been doing social distancing for a couple of months, if they have been able to continue working, and that's probably slowed down their research quite a bit. So you know, these companies are really having to be creative about how do they get back to full capacity and get ramped up again. And then of course there's us, the VCs. You know, are we open for business? You know, the what we would say is absolutely we are, but you have to take all those other factors in consideration. Things could slow down a little bit. People are waiting for valuations to come down. Just be sort of conscious of that in your interactions with investors.
Great. Chris?
Yeah, I'll just share. We have about 10 portfolio companies across our seed and Series A strategies. All of them have been affected to some degree because of COVID, because of delays, you know, supply chain, starting off clinical studies, some preclinical delays, but nothing material where it's going to really change our ability to get to the value inflections from the balance sheets that these companies have. But in terms of deal flow, we did not slow down and maintain the momentum of a lot of companies we were already engaged with. We did close a deal that was announced in March. We've about to close 2 more deals that'll be announced in the coming weeks. We about to pull in another company into our incubator that will get a seed investment. So we've been quite active, and while we have seen more, COVID applications or even companies that have pivoted, they may not have gotten funding on their initial strategy. They said, hey, we've got a COVID solution. I think we're not, we're looking at all of those, and we want to think about, does the technology have something beyond COVID? Because, we don't know what the world's going to look like a year from now, what data readouts they're going to have, which of these modalities or repurposed drugs, are going to have a good COVID data set. But, I think what's important is to recognize the public markets. While we were getting a little nervous in March, they've really rebounded strong. The IPO and follow-on markets have been very strong. And that usually is the leading indicator, right? When you see problems in the public equity markets is when you start to see retrenching and lack of confidence on the private side, which is a laggard in terms of valuations, down rounds, et cetera. And I think right now there's a lot of enthusiasm. Most of that is bolstered, I think, by the COVID and the vaccine, make what you think of that. But I think it's allowed the healthcare sector to say, look, we're a necessary part of any economy. People aren't going to stop getting sick. We're going to need interventions. While people might be challenged with airlines and hospitality and sports and entertainment and some of those sectors, I think it's reinforced that this is a healthy, thriving sector that needs continuity. And so I think from that vantage point, I think we've seen a lot of optimism maintained, and that's trickled down through seed and Series A investing as well.
So Chris, are you telling me, do you get worried when you see artificial intelligence, machine learning, and COVID opportunity in the same website then?
And telemedicine, don't forget.
Oh, yeah, I forgot telemedicine. Okay.
No, it's good. Like, look, Frank said it first, I think. I mean, the world has changed, and we're going to be operating differently, doing business in different ways. I think there's as much good that I see coming out of it as challenges. And, just even this webinar as an example, the number of webinars that reach a lot of people don't need to travel, fly in. You can, get access, get to know new investors, understand, how to proceed, how to contact people, learning from, remote, based geographies. I think all of this is really good. And it's kind of leveled the playing field a little bit that, anybody can jump in if they can write a check and they can make a persuasive argument as a good partner. I think it really has opened the floodgates for a lot of people to be more engaged.
Agreed. Again, and that was actually my next question. So you hit on it, which is really, it's communication, right? So we have this webinar right now, and we're doing everything through Zoom or other video platforms. In this audience, we've got hundreds of potential, new investment opportunities for you. Do you find it easier for entrepreneurs that perhaps have not raised capital before, that are not affiliated with a venture fund, that aren't, an EIR, haven't sold a company before? Is this an opportunity for them to get in front of investors like you a little bit easier, or is it harder? How have you kind of, in terms of the number of call it calls with, early entrants to biotech? Talk about that a little bit in terms of, in the COVID world that we're living in.
I'll jump in just because our model was created before COVID, expressly designed to partner with first-time CEOs, entrepreneurs who are earlier in their careers, who don't have that deep experience. We bring that. I have a team, full-time staff at Xontogeny. We have access to the analysts and managing directors at Perceptive to help us do diligence and to provide guidance. So we play an active role. And, we were doing a lot of this pre-COVID. It's just that I think the method that we're reaching people and kind of letting them know about our model and how we operate, we're agnostic to where those geographies are. We can work with, a researcher or a entrepreneur, or, the company doesn't need to be headquartered in Boston or San Francisco, or even, San Diego, Southern California for that matter. So I think that we are open for business for sure for that kind of model. And I think Frank and Arye, described a similar model, but please.
Yeah, I mean, I would totally echo those sentiments, and I think what I've seen, Jason, to answer your question is the technology, and having talked to a bunch of LPs about this too, just on the fundraising circuit, it's really, I mean, if you ask people 3, 4, or 5 months ago, it's really democratized everything, whether it's LP to VC, whether it's VCs to entrepreneurs who are allocating capital and making investments. It just makes, frankly, it makes everybody's lives more efficient. At the early phases of this process, and when I say this process, I mean the fundraising process, whether it's a direct deal, a company, a fund, whatever, there's really no reason to be having tons of face-to-face meetings and flying all over the world. I mean, if you just think about it, there really isn't. So what this situation has done for everyone is leveled that playing field so that now people who were uncomfortable with it before are now getting comfortable with it. And those of us that were very comfortable with it before are really glad those other people are along for the ride, because it just makes it much more efficient. Again, whether it's the entrepreneurs and the company founders who are on the audience today, most of the audience today, as I understand it, or funds, raising capital. I asked an LP who's looking at us the other day, and I said, short of, what's been your experience so far during this COVID time, and she basically said, short of writing a check, we can pretty much do everything, in this way, in this mechanism. And if you really sit down and think about it, there's absolutely no reason why not, except maybe your own past mores get in your way. But I think at the end of the day, you still want to have a face-to-face, sit down, shake the person's hand. You want to know the person, obviously, but you don't have to have 25 of those. You maybe need to have a couple of those or a few of those, whatever is necessary in your own world to come to that kind of judgment.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with what you guys are saying. I think, it's interesting. We've had to do kind of a lot more of this deliberate community building almost, because we're not able to sort of casually run into people at happy hours or meet them when we're flying into Boston or San Diego or San Francisco. So, in a way where this process of becoming virtual has really been accelerated by COVID-19 across all sorts of sectors, and biotech and VC is certainly one of those where it's become super important. So as we're getting used to these interactions and doing Zoom calls and not being able to meet people face to face, the hope is that will give us greater access to lots of deals that might not be coming from the more traditional places. It would be great if this was kind of a catalyst or a bridge to allow us to find compelling entrepreneurs and startups in some of the places that we would never have visited in a pre-COVID world. So that's certainly my hope, is that it'll extend the reach of kind of what we're doing. And, my hope would be that potentially there's people on this webinar who aren't from Orange County. If this was being held in Irvine, you would have people maybe from LA, maybe from San Diego, but even, for example, we got Chris here today and he's on the East Coast. So I think that would be really interesting to see, how dispersed the geography of folks even on this webinar are. So I'm really excited about that aspect.
Yeah, great. So I know most of the investment thesis, I think certainly with Chris, is much more on the preclinical than the clinical side. But for those entrepreneurs on the call that do have companies that are in the clinic that have been likely much more significantly impacted by COVID than the preclinical, what can you tell those companies and those entrepreneurs in terms of raising capital, given the fact their clinical trials may be stopped, delayed, terminated? Any hopes, any words of wisdom? And then I'll obviously contrast that with kind of the preclinical, and whether for the most part, if they're able to kind of continue their preclinical activities in the ordinary course, how, if at all, COVID has impacted that.
Maybe I'll start. I mean, I don't know about words of wisdom, but I would do the same things you probably do. You should be doing in your personal life. Hunker down, conserve cash, extend your runway, and be smart. And just play safe for another day. This is starting to kind of blow through. Now obviously there's areas of the country where it's worse than others, you know, in certain parts, like I think where Arye is and where I am, you know, we're already into phase 3 and you know, gradual reopening and so forth. So I don't know that they're necessarily, you know, words of wisdom, but I think, you know, the last thing that you can and should be doing is overextending. Obviously, try to conserve cash, eliminate unnecessary expenses wherever possible. And obviously, you're constantly, you know, reaching out and fundraising and trying to connect and so forth. That's kind of a given. But on the expense, you know, on the expense side of things, you know, I think you got to be doing all those things and really doubling down on non-dilutive too. I mean, everybody talks about it. Obviously, in the COVID world, there's a you know, a fire hose worth of non-dilutive that's now becoming rapidly available from a variety of perspectives, BARDA, et cetera, et cetera. But you know, that's an area where I think I'm personally, at least as an investor, always very impressed with people who have been able to raise enormous amounts of non-dilutive capital and preserve the equity cap table for those investors. Not to talk my own book, but I mean, I sort of personally did that with one of my companies where we raised a lot of money, but never touched the equity cap table, just through creative mechanisms. So if entrepreneurs and founders can figure out a way to do that, and not just sort of take, you know, no or no at the third door or whatever, which most good entrepreneurs never do, then I think that's another area that has to be just fully exploited. Just don't stop. There's lots of areas to open up in that space, and I would doubt that folks have tapped all of them.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say, Frank said it well. I mean, the first thing everybody did in March was to assess their current portfolio companies and the balance sheets, and any delays, dial that in, and sometimes rationalize, reprioritize, et cetera. So, you know, that's the first thing any company should do, is make sure they can get to the right value inflection from the money that they have on hand. But, you know, from those companies in the clinical setting where there's a lot of delays and even difficulty continuing enrollment, you know, I think that has been met with a signal by the FDA of a lot of flexibility. The fact that they went out with guidelines related to clinical trials that were impacted with COVID, not related to COVID, but were impacted by COVID, that was so quick, and very nice to see that posture from the FDA. And I think we'll all be looking at companies that, you know, might have incomplete data sets, or, more difficult, statistical analyses because of missing data, and how the FDA works through that, knowing that there was no way to really avoid being impacted in the clinic. Preclinically, I think there have been general delays, and the queues have stacked up. There were some shortages with non-human primates to do studies, and costs were going up in some cases. But I think for the most part, they have worked themselves out. Some of the academic labs were shut down to preserve PPE and to make sure that all staff were available for COVID. But I'd say nothing that has been a major shock to kind of continuity of business, and I think that's been a good thing, at least as it relates to the portfolio we manage.
I'll add a couple of things on the preclinical side. I think one thing that's been interesting to see is that the companies in our portfolio that have really innovative data management and automation of their early stage research have kind of managed to really lean into that. And I think that really would be a silver lining to come out of this whole pandemic, is that the companies who have thought about automation, even at the earliest stages, who have thought about novel data management strategies where you could have a much leaner staff physically in the lab doing this preclinical research, those are the companies that are going to really be able to continue to accelerate through this process. So we've seen a lot of companies lean into their strategies there and also start implementing new kind of automation strategies as best they can. And these tools are, getting cheaper and cheaper year by year. So even some of these early stage preclinical companies can now afford to have, lab automation robots and equipment of that nature. So really excited to see that grow, and kind of the hope is that that will continue to be a part of preclinical research going forward.
So Arye, I'll direct this next question to you. And given the fact that ULP is an OC-based company, and we probably have a lot of entrepreneurs from Orange County that are involved in med device, med tech, healthcare IT. And I know at least a portion of your portfolio investment thesis is in that area. How have you seen COVID impacting those companies, especially given the supply chain and, the fact that many of those may be more in the clinic, testing their products. So if you can talk about the med device side of the things in terms of how it's been impacted by COVID.
Yeah, I mean, that's been really, it's been a challenge on a number of levels. Obviously, there's all the issues with supply chain where, if you're designing prototypes or working on the next iteration of your device, actually accessing the components that you need, not only because they might be getting hoovered up by other entities that are making ventilators or things of that nature, also because many of them come from China. And, Lord knows there's not a lot of shipments coming in from China that aren't PPE. So there's obviously big issues with accessing the components that these folks need. And then there's kind of the ancillary challenges in that the device development capacity and know-how and knowledge is kind of very quickly pivoting in a different direction. People are working on laminar flow assays for point of care serological tests for COVID-19. People are working on ventilators and respirators. So if you're trying to stay on track as a medtech company, I can definitely appreciate that challenge. And it's kind of a similar one to what we discussed with regards to clinical trials being slowed down. It may be a matter of conserving cash, waiting until the supply chain bounces back. And already we're seeing things start to get back to normal to some degree. So I don't expect that disruption to continue for more than another few months.
Okay. Frank, let me ask you a question. You mentioned being impressed by companies that don't touch their equity cap table. Can you talk to the audience about ways that companies can raise non-dilutive, non-equity dilutive funding? At least whether you've done it personally or other suggestions that you may have had or heard of?
Yeah, sure. So I kind of divide the answer into kind of two buckets. So one is your, very traditional sources of non-dilutive financing. And you can just Google, all those topics and a whole laundry list of things are going to pop up, whether it's federal, state, local, groups that work with various incubators, accelerators around the country, et cetera. I mean, there's not time in this platform to go through them all, but there's dozens, if not hundreds, that are very, very useful. There are some that are not so useful and extremely laborious and time consuming to get a very small amount of money. And historically, sometimes, beggars can't be choosers, but sometimes I've looked at those in the past when I was an entrepreneur and CEO and thought, well, that's just an enormous amount of a lift to get, I don't know, 50,000 or whatever it is. So it depends what your endpoint is, what your goal is, how much money do you need, what the use of proceeds is, for the cash. So that's basically kind of one bucket, or those traditional sources of non-dilutive. The other bucket, I would just sort of put a kind of a title over it, just called kind of creative non-dilutive. And so at least in my personal case, it's a very kind of unique story. But I founded a company back in 2010 called Triphase. We did a large multi-billion-dollar deal with Celgene at the time. It was a very esoteric type of deal where we creatively allowed the company to tap into their ex-US cash, bring it back to the US tax neutral, and then keep all those expenses off the P&L. So that was a kind of a holy grail for farmers who had cash trapped overseas at the time. That's just one example of, creative non-dilutive. In that case, a lot of smart folks, I kind of surrounded myself with, and we figured out a way to kind of make that happen. It was the very first one or two of those types of deals that Celgene did, like 10 years ago now or so. But there's other things that I would sort of put in that bucket. That never happened until we made it happen. So, that's sort of in the kind of the creative bucket. There are different ways to tap into those, whether they're philanthropic situations, whether there's, extremely wealthy people who've been touched by certain types of diseases or one way or the other. There's different ways to tap into that. So whether it's foundations or the like. So there's different models for those sorts of things. And it's really just about just keep persevering, pressing on, overturning every stone, and just sort of, just keep trying everything.
Chris, let me ask you a question. You touched on something which I found interesting, that you mentioned that COVID was kind of a great geographical equalizer, where because everyone's for the most part at home, it doesn't matter whether you're in Boston or in San Francisco or in San Diego, one of these traditional life science clusters. Do you think that same general view is going to apply when this ends and whenever that may be? Or is this going to be a short-lived, a different viewpoint?
Yeah, I think it depends on the stage of the company and what research is being done. So if you think about the large venture firms who are doing the big platform discovery, company creation models, they're putting in $100 million into a Series A or several $100 million in before they have a drug that's being treated in a patient, in the clinic. And so I think for those, they're going to want their proprietary lab space. They'll hire lots of chemists and biologists and translational medicine and formulation folks. That's a different model, and they tend to want to be there, right? And in proximity. Interestingly, what I've heard generally from COVID is while the lab workers are going back, a lot of the executives aren't even going in to oversee those lab workers and are working remotely from home. So I think if you are at the stage, and we like to work with companies that already have a lead compound that might need some medicinal chemistry or some optimization, but most of that is outsourced. So you're dealing with CROs, and you really don't care where those CROs are located. Sometimes they're offshore, or a phase 1 might be in Wisconsin or something. And so I think from that standpoint, whether it's manufacturing source, preclinical CROs, clinical CROs, I think it becomes less critical where the company is located in headquarters. But we had a company that we seeded and funded called Landos in the inflammatory bowel disease space. It was based in Blacksburg, Virginia. The technology was from a researcher out of Virginia Tech. Only now, as we think about taking the company public, are we thinking about relocating, establishing a new headquarters where we can hire, C-suite executives, a bigger team. So if you do it right, you can actually move these programs along remotely through outsourcing, and it's not as critical. And I think especially now when you have more of these kind of Zoom type interactivity models, people are getting used to interacting this way. I mean, I joke with my team, when Boston is still closed, by the way. June 1st starts phase 1 in Boston. But even when our team is able to go back into the office, it's likely that we're all going to be at our desk, having a one-on-one window here to interact with the companies we face. We're not going to be huddled in a conference room trying to squeeze ourselves into, the camera. And so I think from that vantage point, I think it will make, remote-based management much easier. Look, people had an aversion to doing these types of video conferences for the most part, and they almost would rather be on a plane and meet in person. I think that has changed fundamentally now, and I think people have gotten over whatever discomfort or dislike they might have had around video conferences. There's no way around it now.
Arye, anything else you want to add on that?
I would say it is actually one thing I'll just add, kind of a little, I don't know, an aside, but it is actually nice to use audio only sometimes. I've found that to be quite useful just in terms of certain interactions that other people, I think it's also kind of personality based. Some people really jive well with the video stuff. Some people find it extremely exhausting. So it's been kind of fun to explore new ways of interacting, figure out what people are most comfortable with. But yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree. It's a whole new world, and I can count the number of video calls I took on one hand before this whole COVID-19 thing. So
I can give you guys another example. It's totally non-biotech related, but any parent might appreciate this. So, all government activity, of course, has gone to this type of communication. So we recently had a couple of school board meetings locally for my two daughters, and it was really around final vote to build this new school. Now, as everybody knows, it's sometimes a little bit disconcerting to go up to a microphone and speak publicly for 3 minutes on a topic that you're a little shaky on or whatever. Not everybody wants to do that. Everyone's looking at me, whatever. So usually at these meetings, you get 5 or 10, maybe 15 people come to the microphone. 300 people came on the Zoom platform and spoke their piece. Some of them hidden, to Ari's point, didn't want to show their face or whatever. most of them not, but 300 people for a little elementary school. I think that shows you the power of how the technology is changing things.
Frank, you talked a little bit about how in the last 8-10 weeks since COVID, that there are a number of investment opportunities that are not COVID related that you perhaps maybe overlooked by other investors, or companies that are in need of capital and having now to stretch. Can you talk about those types of companies and how kind of the valuation gap has been bridged at all between investors wanting lower and companies wanting higher?
Yeah, I mean, not to talk too many specifics, because some of these are in play right now, but I mean, just from a general, perspective, some of these are ones that were kind of, ready and waiting to be extracted out of the university setting. Some of these are ones that had already been extracted and are kind of, they were kind of dying on the small amount of friends and family or whatever capital they had in that first 6 or 12 months out. From a therapeutic, et cetera, perspective, we mainly focus on oncology and immunology, gene therapy, cell therapy areas. So we're seeing a lot of things, sort of in that space. Again, kind of non-COVID related. Valuations is an interesting one. I think last week or earlier this week, I saw 2 very similar companies, 2 very similar asks, 2 very similar profiles. One had like a 2x liquidation preference on the term sheet and one didn't. So I think sometimes it just sort of depends on, the overall triangulation of all the different terms, how that fits into the profile that the investor is looking for. And frankly, you have to think about, this is a branding exercise. So for all you entrepreneurs and company builders out there listening, you got to be thinking about how to brand yourself and your company from the get-go. So you have to think about differentiation of the asset, the company, and differentiation in the eyes of all the investors you're going to talk to, because all of us see a lot of different deals every single week. So how are you going to make those terms or the profile of your enterprise stand out? And so I would just encourage folks to think a lot, about that. Just doing the garden variety terms will put you kind of in the garden variety bucket.
Chris, do you want to share your perspective on any interesting kind of valuation gaps, different changing terms, and even if you want to talk about if you have different viewpoints on any therapeutic targets or types of companies that you're looking at?
Yeah, I think for all the non-COVID opportunities, I think our strategy has remained consistent. I would say there's maybe a slight more appreciation for infectious disease. You think about secondary infections on a viral pneumonia. Or pulmonary applications, if people are thinking about, complications of the lungs. COVID is kind of enhanced, right, the potential attractiveness of those. But looking at some of the questions that came in through the Q&A, it's about what has changed. And I think someone asked about clinical trial management. I do think we're going to see a fundamental shift in not only the FDA flexibility, which we touched on, but how clinical trials are conducted. The idea of, elective procedures being kind of halted, clinical trial visits being, stopped while, institutions prepared to deal with COVID patients. This has moved all of these institutions to telemedicine. I mean, I remember in mid-March hearing the CEO of Brigham Women's Hospital say, they went from 16 telemedicine visits to 3,000 the next week, okay? And so just like we're getting used to Zoom as a new way to communicate, these institutions are getting used to telemedicine. And I think the FDA is right there and trying to understand what impact is this gonna have to be able to measure. I know we have a point of care diagnostic company that had a consumer play, and it had an AI component where you could do some of this at home. Well, we're now turning that into more of a telemedicine play and enhancing that interface that we were originally planning on, because we think it could have a lot more functionality and a lot more value to get other kind of diagnostic criteria into it. So I think if we look at this time point, it's not going to happen overnight, but I think if you fast forward 5 years, this has accelerated and kickstarted this idea of using wearable sensors, the real world evidence that the FDA has been touting, patient-reported outcomes, remote-based capture of clinical study, endpoints. I think you're going to see that start to gain traction, and it's going to become more commonplace and maybe, best practice, state of the art, 5, to 10 years from now.
Yeah, I can add just a couple quick.
Yeah,
I'll add a couple quick more thoughts on that. I think something to keep in mind for all the startups in the audience. The typical lifetime of a venture fund is 10 years. So any one specific sort of point in time or a specific crisis, in theory, should not disrupt that sort of path or that plan. That theory behind the venture fund meant to last 10 years. It's investments lasting that duration of time. So I think you need to kind of keep that in mind. And we haven't changed our thesis around looking for big, non-incremental types of advances. And especially in the healthcare space, if you're going after some specific indication, it's unlikely that much has changed. If you're going after Alzheimer's, it's as bad as it was 4 months ago as it is today. If you're going after IBS, if you're going after various oncology applications, they're as bad as they were a few months ago, if not worse. So, we're kind of privileged to be in this sector where, a lot of the sort of demand for the products that people are making has not changed. We're not going after consumer products normally. We're not making entertaining apps, although some of those are doing very well these days. So, the need for the products that are made using biotech and life sciences remains and is greater than ever. So just looking at it from that perspective, startups shouldn't be particularly concerned or worried or scared that our strategies have completely changed. If you had a really innovative idea 4 months ago, you should still be able to raise financing from a venture fund such as ourselves.
A few other questions. Are there certain examples where there was investment opportunity, but because you couldn't meet the entrepreneur or the executives face to face, you haven't pulled the trigger? Or other instances where perhaps you've backed out of or decided not to make the investment for whether it's the inability to do face-to-face diligence or anything else that kind of is whether directly or indirectly related to COVID? Frank,
I'll share an example and where I think the need for that personal contact and kind of informal engagement is important. And I'm going to make a slight generalization. Sometimes when you're dealing with a new, entrepreneur, founder of a company, there's a lot of skepticism and maybe cynicism around trust, right? Is this, this is a venture capitalist, right? They're always going to, make it difficult for me. They're going to end up with a better deal. And I think that in the past, we've been able to really impress upon them that we are collaborative partners. We're here to make a win-win so that if we do it right, we all make out well. And, there was a recent interaction where we didn't have the benefit of that. And, everything doesn't always translate well on the phone, right? And, we have various team members who are interacting with them. It's not all in the same room, right? We're not taking them out to lunch or dinner to get to know them. And so I do think that that's an important part of the process in establishing that trust that, hey, we're in this together. If we do a bad job, we all lose, right? We're here to help, and we all want to see this a success and you're going to benefit in that. And, we try to convey that, but sometimes that doesn't translate, even on a video call, definitely not on a phone call. And so I think we miss that. We miss that engagement. And I think we look forward to at least, Frank said this earlier, you try to have a few in-person touch points and, we've had to try to broker some of these deals and move through the process without that. And I think something's lost, in that, nonverbal, intangible kind of bonding and trust.
Yeah. I think that's a great point, Chris. I would totally agree. And I didn't just want to suggest, that those elements were not necessary. They definitely are necessary. I think it's a question of how they get balanced together in this new world order. And it's not just a linear equation, right? I mean, we all know lots of different people. So my ability to know Chris is not just based on my relationship directly with Chris. Chris probably knows a bunch of people who knows a bunch of people that know me, and vice versa. And so those people are talking, and then they're forming views and opinions about each other. And so there's all these different dimensions that are going to go into, how either the business or the person or the team or whatever is evaluated. Totally are going to need some of those face-to-face, touch points, as the process goes. And to the extent that there's, not, then we're going to have to be a bit more reliant on, referrals, recommendations, references, very similar things like that. I mean, to me, it's not unlike dating, although I've been married for 10 years now and have 2 kids, but it's kind of like it's the process. I mean, you wouldn't just, get married to someone within 3 weeks. You sort of need to go through this whole process of learning about them and who they are and what makes them tick and, and so forth.
Well, I'll read a few questions from the audience. We've got a question. What would you expect to be bottlenecks for entrepreneurial ventures post-COVID? Risk assessment is always a sticking point for investors, and some are highly tolerant toward risk, whereas some are timid. This can be challenging for early stage startups. What would you recommend startups do to mitigate investor anxieties? Arye, you want to start there?
Yeah, I mean, I think one point I would add there is that, investors have different risk profiles and different appetites for what kind of risk they want to take on, different stages and so on and so forth. I think if I were an entrepreneur or startup raising, I would have to make it would be recommended to make an effort as to how the risk profile changes in a post-COVID world compared to how the risk profile looked before. So are there specific risks that are now implicit in your strategy because we're living in a post-COVID world? Can you explain and retire some of those risks to your investors? I think that would be really probably the primary change. Because like I said, if you're going after some big indication, if you have a set of IP you're working on, you've licensed from a university, what has really changed? COVID-19 has changed. So maybe if you can give a good explanation of how you're going to retire that COVID-related risk around your clinical trials or around social distancing in the lab or whatever, that would be important. But otherwise, you should already be explaining your risk profile as it was 4 months ago to these investors, and they're going to like it or they're not going to.
Terrific.
I'll just say briefly, budgeting and, creating those line items and what work do you want to do and what CROs are going to use. You want to make sure that you have up-to-date understanding and information. Maybe some of the G&A costs go down because you don't need to travel everywhere, et cetera. So I think, it's really focusing on the budget and that you have real clarity and understanding of what you need and where that's going to get you.
Okay. Frank, anything else?
No, I think they covered it nicely. I did see one other question. I'm just sort of trying to, I know they keep queuing up in the Q&A thing, though. I did see one question from someone about other creative sources of non-dilutive. I mean, so just one other, one to throw out there, which is, fairly typically used in our business these days, are, getting strategic investors. So for example, in the biotech space, pharma strategics or medical device strategic investors to put together option style deals, providing non-dilutive capital, in which case they would, pony up a sizable chunk of upfront capital that would not touch your equity cap table, but would be used to essentially purchase an option to acquire an asset downstream based on a certain set of criteria being met. So this was the quasi structure that I use in one of my 3 CEO gigs. And so that's a very common structure. It's like Baskin Robbins though. It's got like 40 flavors now. So it's one structure, but there's a lot of different flavors to it. So there's a lot of creativity and nuancing that can kind of go into that.
Great. Karen, how much more time is it? It's 4:02.
We can go another like 10 minutes or so if you guys like, if there's more questions coming in.
Sure. I'm just flipping through. Well, let me just ask a general question. I mean, so, we've got, hundreds of entrepreneurs on the line here. What advice would you give them in this age of COVID? in terms of raising capital and opportunities to connect perhaps more easily now.
You know, one of the things that often happens when there's broader economic uncertainty and despite the strength of the healthcare is that, you know, entrepreneurship and risk tolerance, right, tends to go down, right? You know, they might be looking at their stock portfolio and it's less than it was a few months ago. Maybe their spouse is saying, are you sure this is the right time to be trying something out that's so risky, you know? And so, you know, I think from that vantage point is, you know, it may take more time. It may take more perseverance, right? In situations like this, you know, I know like business development, you know, a lot of the pharma biotechs have focused on their COVID deals and, you know, have kind of put a backseat and reprioritized. So I kind of encourage all, you know, CEOs that we interact with, like, if you can do this part-time, right? It shouldn't be a full-time job until you have money to spend, right? And to move it forward. And a lot of them do that, right? They're working on a business plan. They're talking to investors, you know, while they have a full-time, you know, job. But, you know, I think the money is there. You know, startups will continue to be funded. And so I just want to send an encouraging note to the entrepreneurs out there, you know, keep at it. Like, you know, the money's there. We're interested. We want to hear about new technologies. And, you know, just don't put all your eggs in that you're going to get a deal signed in the next 3 months, right? You know, have some contingency plans.
So Chris, are you saying that day trading and being a biotech CEO is not a good combination then?
Guess it depends on how good of a day trader you are.
I would totally echo Chris's comments. I think the only difference between two entrepreneurs that show up, you know, at my office or on my screen now or whatever is, you know, or, you know, the one who shows up and gets the meeting is the one who didn't give up. The one who didn't show up gave up. So that's what I teach my kids. Just don't give up.
Yeah, the other thing I'd add, I mean, I absolutely agree. It is kind of a scary time to be thinking about quitting your job and starting a company. You know, historically, the most resilient, strongest, most highly valued companies are built in downturns, and it's kind of that only the strong survive type thing. So that's maybe not enough evidence to really make someone feel confident about taking the leap, but just keep that in mind. And then on the flip side, you know, the most attractive time to be deploying capital as an investor is during a downturn. This is the time to invest. You know, this is the time that all of us are prioritizing injecting money into new companies. Like, we want to give you money, basically. So this is the best time to be investing rather than at the top of a hype cycle. So keep that in mind. There's a lot of factors and sort of tailwinds that might be able to help you in a time like this to start something new.
Terrific. Well, I think, Aaron, that was a really positive way to end it. It sounds like there's available capital, there's some dry powder, and you know, for all the entrepreneurs on the phone, go contact these guys.